from Jackson's Mill, West Virginia, here in Lewis County. While here, see places such as Jackson's Mill, Weston, and Jane Lou. We'll also speak with Joy DeFazio of the Hackers Creek Pioneer Descendants, Sarah Loughrie, Historic Tour Manager for the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Dean Hardman, Program Specialist for the Heritage Program at Jackson's Mill, and Chad Proudfoot, Cultural Resource Specialist for the West Virginia 4-H Program, and all give us a detailed account of some of Lewis County's history and culture.
Was about 1768. Two brothers by the name of John and Sam Pringle had been serving in the English Army at Fort Pitt, which of course is now where Pittsburgh is. And they were not happy. They didn't like being told what they were going to do. These guys were frontiersmen, tough. I always think of them as being a little burly. Anyway, they with three other men went AWOL. And they went over in the part of the eastern seaboard, which is now Maryland. If you think about it, it's between the northern panhandle and the eastern panhandle along on the Youghiogheny River. And they were hunting and trapping there. They met up with a man by the name of John Simpson. And he made a deal with them. If they would hunt and trap for him, he would sell their furs and the things they gathered, and at the same time provide them with ammunition. And they decided to come west, and they got as far as the Forks of Cheat in Montague County. Got into an argument, Simpson and the brothers. And they ended up, Simpson came on to what is now Harrison County, out near where the interstate is now on I-79 in Bridgeport. And that's where he set up a trading post with the Indians. John and Sam Pringle went to what they knew as the Hunter's Tree in Upshur County. And of course it wasn't Upshur County then, it was all part of West Augusta. And this Hunter's Tree was a huge sycamore tree. It said it was so large that you could turn a fence post around it. Well, a fence post in those days was those worm fences like this, and those posts were 12 feet long. That was the standard. That way a man could erect his fence and he could measure his land by looking at those posts. And they took up their abode in that tree. They had a little bit of ammunition, and they lived there for 3 years. So they finally began to run out of ammunition, and they decided that one brother would remain at the tree, and the other brother would follow the Indian Trail back to the south branch of the Potomac at Oldfields, where there was a fort, and find out if they'd sneak in town and see if they were still wanted. The war was over. The French and Indian War was over. They were not wanted, and there were people, their families back home, back at Fort Pleasant, were wondering where they were, if they were okay. So they went back and started sharing the word, told people about this wonderful land across the mountains on an old Indian trail that was just right for settlers. One of the brothers brought the first party of settlers with him. Shortly thereafter, the other brother brought another group of settlers, and part of the group wanted to go out and explore. They were not interested in homes or anything else, but some of them were. So the ones who stayed there at the tree began staking their claims to pieces of ground, and the other group went out hunting and trapping and just exploring the countryside. It said that they got down as far down into Calhoun County, down Webster County, down that way. When they got back, they discovered that one of the Pringle brothers had already claimed the piece of land that John Hacker had set his claim on. John was one of the homeseekers, and he wasn't interested in exploring. Mr. Pringle and John Hacker decided they would trade pieces of land because there was a piece, Pringle had seen this tract of land over on what is now we call Hackers Creek, that was beautiful. It was a wide valley, great land, warmer than a lot of other places. Shortly thereafter, a man by the name of Henry Flesher came over. He was a German. You know, there were a lot of Germans along through the Valley of Virginia at the time. Henry came over. He said he claimed some land in what is today Weston, built his cabin near the corner of First Street and Main Avenue, and built his barn where is now the courthouse. And although many years would pass, another 50 years, that area would become what is today the city of Weston and was the county seat. Okay, when they were going to establish the town of Weston, the county seat was, they had planned to have it but Westfield. But three men by the name of Johnson, Maxwell, and Stringer had managed to buy some property from Henry Flesher. Later, he would not be happy with that decision. But they bought the property that is now, includes the courthouse. As I said, Henry Flesher had his home just around the corner. It did not include that. But they bought that tract of land, and then they ended up selling the tract that included the courthouse to the county government. During the Civil War, Weston was, as we know, Lewis County particularly, was the home of two Civil War generals, Joseph A.J. Lightburn and Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. And they were boyhood friends. During the Civil War, there were two factions in town even. And Weston was raided several times or occupied several times by different factions, sometimes by the Confederates, sometimes by the Union. And some of their camps were set up, one particularly Camp Tyler was set up on the what is now the State Hospital grounds. Anyway, Weston began to grow. In time, it would become a business hub. And after the war was over, they began to, timbering became a big thing as they were expanding. There had been some sawmills built around, and then shortly after that, the trains came through. And they were able to move, part of the timber that was timbered was floated down the river, and it said that still some places in the West Fork River, you can find timber that was, where they've sunk, because once a log sinks, it's protected. It doesn't rot away. It stays there. Along about 1890, there was exploration going on for oil. There had been the big oil boom up in Pennsylvania, and they began drilling a well down at Copley in Lewis County. And they'd been, the drillers lived they had their camps that they lived in. And this particular night, they were sitting on the porch of the Copley family farmhouse when the earth began to shake and rattle. And this gusher came in. And it is said that it flowed so much that it was 7 miles. The flow had reached 7 miles downstream. But that oil and other natural gas wells were the beginning of the industrialization of Lewis County, because now we had fuel to fire furnaces for gas. Some men had immigrated from Austria and came to Buchanan, and they came here to Lewis County and began manufacturing glass. Among the workers were people from Austria, some Germans, and Belgians. And in fact, my great-grandfather was among those who came just around the year 1905, 1907, and was working, making glass at what was called the Crescent Factory, which is one of the early glass factories. There were, at one time, I think 7 or 8 shops, glass factories in Weston. It's told that someone had gone to Italy. This was in more like in the 50s. Had gone to Italy and going to buy a gift to bring back home, and they found this wonderful piece of glass. They were going to buy it, bring it home to give to somebody. And they went to the back room, the proprietor did, to get the box to put it in, and what does it say? Made in Weston, West Virginia. So we had a world outreach that way. And glass continued to be a major industrial business in Lewis County for years and years and years.
Construction began here in 1858. It was commissioned by the State of Virginia legislature, and it started shortly after the commission of the funds. It ended in 1881, taking a little over 20 years to complete. It was paused not only by the Civil War, but also because West Virginia became its own state in 1863. So that, of course, had an impact on the construction here at the asylum. Now, the name Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the original name given to the facility by the state of Virginia. But when West Virginia became its own state in 1863, they changed the name to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, and it then became the Weston State Hospital. We are the largest hand-cut blue sandstone building in the United States, 1,295 feet long. We are 25 feet shy of being a quarter of a mile long, 9 acres of floor space, 3 acres of roofing. We have about 26 miles of telephone line, 16 miles of steam pipe, 926 windows, and 916 doors. We also have about 11 structures here on the campus. There is the tuberculosis building, which was built in 1941. We also have a forensics unit for the criminally insane, a geriatrics building, ladies auxiliary unit, maintenance garage, boiler house, kitchen, 2 canteens, and by far the most interesting is in fact the medical center, which was built in 1930. It was a hospital for the hospital. Not only did the patients use it here, but the townspeople did as well. In emergency situations, they could come and get emergency care here at this facility. It was never thought of in a negative light. In fact, the town of Weston always embraced the hospital being here. There was a time when the hospital itself was in fact so integrated into the town that you couldn't distinguish between the two. The town of Weston's history is so far inbred into the hospital history and the history of the hospital inbred into the town of Weston that the two really cannot be actually separated. In 1967, there were 2,600 patients here at the facility. We were so terribly overpopulated that there were beds lining the hallways. The large dorm rooms had about 12 patients in them. We had one dorm room that had about 114 patients crammed into it. Nurses have told me that they had to pull the beds out away from the walls to actually remove the patients and care for them. It was like that not only at this hospital, but every mental institution, state mental institution across the United States. But if you can actually justify that amount, that was almost a little bit over half of the population here in the town of Weston itself. So that gives you an idea of how many people was in this facility alone. We had a wide variety of different treatments used here at the hospital, everything from patients working as a part of their treatment on the farmlands, in the canneries, the tanneries, the seamstress shop, around housekeeping here at the hospital, but also we gave them treatments in later years known as hydrotherapy. We gave them insulin shock therapy, electroshock therapy, which is now ECTs, electroconvulsive therapy, and also frontal lobe lobotomies, which by far were the most barbaric treatments ever used on patients. However, at that time period, that was a common use for patients with mental illnesses. It was a surgical procedure, and it was known to actually make patients better, which more or less meant they were more compliant and would listen to the staff here at the hospital a lot better. State institutions like this one would use them quite regularly because it made the patients calmer, made the nurses' jobs a lot easier. The invention of Thorazine in 1954 completely revolutionized the way we treated patients with mental illnesses. It was dubbed the liquid lobotomy and would do the same things a lobotomy would do, but without the nasty side effects that go along with it. And it completely swept through state institutions like this one because it was so easy to give to the patients. It was in liquid form. Patients would drink it, and then in about 15 minutes they would be asleep. So it was more or less making the patients to where they could function lethargically, but still be out of the nurse's hair at the same time. The hospital here closed as a hospital in 1994. The patients that remained here went to William R. Sharp. And sadly, this building sat vacant for about 13 years. When the Jordan family purchased it in 2007 and realized the rich history behind the hospital and not only this facility, but facilities like it across the United States, they decided to open it up, preserve it, and open it up for historic tours. We do not only the historic tours, ranging from $100 for a photography tour, but also paranormal tours as well. We do a little bit of everything here, trying to make money to go right back into the preservation of the Kirkbride building, one of the few standing today. There are about 11 structures like this one standing, and sadly we're the only ones open to the public, allowing them to come in, embrace the history of the facility and mental illness.
was a significant part of the community here in Harrison County at the time when Colonel Edward Jackson settled the property. Now, Colonel Edward Jackson was the grandfather of the famous Stonewall Jackson. He settled here in the late 1700s, here on Pedro's Fish Pot, which was the name of the water hole here at the West Fork. He was looking for an area that he could start a grist milling operation, and he did. He started a grist milling operation on the far side of the river, over on where Sycamore Lick is today. He also eventually started a timbering industry here at Jackson's Mill. So industrial-wise here at Jackson's Mill, it was very significant for the area because they had grist milling where they could grind the corns and the wheats and the rye and the barleys and grains of the area. But when you came here, you could also go to the blacksmith shop and had iron work done. There was also a leather shop here as well, so you could have maybe a saddle fixed as well. Also, they had the water-powered sawmill. They had a sash mill. Most of the original town of Weston, which was called Fletchersville at the time, was built from sawn timber here at Jackson's Mill. Now, later on, Jackson's father married, moved to Clarksburg, had two children before Stonewall. Unfortunately, his older sister came down with typhoid fever. His mother was pregnant with his younger sister at the time, and so she was not able to tend to the older sister. So the father did. The father tended to her and unfortunately came down and contracted the fever as well. Both of them died within a very short period of each other, and within a week after the father's death, the younger sister was born. His father was a lawyer by trade, did a lot of tax work, and took on a lot of tax debts. A very young lawyer, so he knew he had long periods of time to take care of those debts and collect those taxes and take care of it. Unfortunately, he died at a young age, owing a lot of money. So the Jackson family had to sell all their belongings, including their home in Clarksburg, West Virginia. His father was a Mason, so the Masonic Temple had a small one-room house out behind the Masonic Temple. They lived there for a short period of time until she remarried. They moved to Anstead. During her pregnancy by the second husband, she became very, very ill. And this is where Jackson's Mill and Stonewall Jackson come to be. Stonewall, Thomas Jackson as we call him here at Jackson's Mill, and his younger sister Laura were sent here to Jackson's Mill to live with their step-grandmother and their uncles here on the farmstead, only for a short period of time until his mother had the baby and became feeling better. Unfortunately, after she had the baby, she became much worse. The children were summoned back to Anstead just in time to tell their mother goodbye. So he and his younger sister Laura came back to live here at Jackson's Mill more on a permanent basis at this point. He was the age of around 6 and his younger sister was about 3 years of age. She stayed on until the step-grandmother passed away and then eventually went to live with her mother's family because there was no women folk. It wasn't really a proper place for a young lady to be with not very good influences, no lady influences. But Tom Jackson stayed on mostly until he was 18 years old. Now, he did go on a couple entrepreneurial adventures. He and his older brother went over and down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, took up timbering on an island and selling those timbers to the steamers going up and down the river. Unfortunately, they both came down with malaria. And if it had been for one of their customers finding them, they probably would have died on the island, in my opinion. But they were brought back to Parkersburg, tended to by his mother's family in Parkersburg. He eventually became well enough to come back to Jackson's Mill. But both had lingering effects from malaria. Jackson, later on in his life, had a lot of ailments, and part of those could have gone back to his days of malaria. But Jackson came here, back to the farm. He eventually took over he worked in the grist mill, but also took over the operation of the timbering industry here. He operated the cutting of the timber, floating it down the river, also oversaw some of the operations in the sawmill as well. At a very young age, at 17, he became a constable here in town, which was quite unusual because you really couldn't be a constable until you were 18 years of age. But the Jackson family had a lot of influence, a lot of political influence as well as social influence in the communities. One of the stories that was told about Jackson I think is quite interesting. It shows a lot about his character is that he had one gentleman who owed money to an elderly lady who was a widower. and he would not pay the debt. So Jackson's job as constable, which was somewhat of a tax collector at the time, went after the gentleman. And you could take a man's horse, but you could not take his horse as long as he was riding it. So every time he would see Jackson coming up the street, he would jump up on his horse and he would somewhat snicker at Jackson. Well, one morning early, he saw the gentleman coming out of the stables in what's now known as Weston. As Jackson walked up, grabbed the horse by the reins, turned it back into the stable. The door was too low. The gentleman had to jump off. So Jackson now had the horse to collect the debt. Very quickly, the gentleman paid off the debt because a man's horse was quite valuable to him. But Jackson grew up here living with his uncle Cummins Jackson, who was probably not the best influence. He didn't believe in education. He didn't believe in religion. He believed that you needed a trade, and that's all you needed. And he was teaching Jackson the milling trade, and pretty much that was all he needed. But then there was a family that moved into the area named the Lightburn family. He befriended the young Joe Lightburn, who was about the same age as Tom. And the Lightburn family had an extensive library and began loaning Jackson books to read after his work was done on the farm. They also introduced him to religion for the first time at the Broad Run Baptist Church. In fact, Jackson, on his return trips as an adult, would always stop by, if he was here on Sunday, and stop by the Broad Run Baptist Church and attend services there. So the Lightburn family really introduced Jackson to the two things that became lifelong things that Jackson really yearned for, and that was education and religion. He traveled the world as he became a military, working in the United States Army and then eventually into the Confederate Army of the Civil War. But he searched for many years for the right religion and found it in Lexington many years after leaving here at Jackson's Mill. But Jackson's Mill was probably the formative years of Tom Jackson. What we say is the area that made the boy into the man that we know as Stonewall. And even on his deathbed, in our opinion, in many historians' opinion, his last phrase was, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And we believe that he was talking about here at Jackson's Mill, because many years earlier, one of the servants here had helped him build a flat-bottom boat, and he would float across the West Fork River to a grove of trees and think about what this young Tom Jackson, what he was going to do with his life. He was orphaned, motherless and fatherless, and really not much hope for a future, what he was going to do. And the one place that he ever believed that he had as home was here at Jackson's Mill. And so even on his deathbed, he was going back to that wonderful place that he remembered as a child.
Well, nationally, the 4-H program started in 1902 in Springfield, Ohio, and a man by the name of A.B. Graham is generally considered to be the founder of 4-H. There's several folks that sort of lay claim to things, but his seems to be the strongest in terms of what we consider to be the history of 4-H. And it really just started as a way to get boys and girls together to deal with finding new methods in agriculture and growing crops. A lot of the original clubs were called corn clubs, or a lot of times for girls were called tomato clubs, things of that nature. And 4-H came to West Virginia in 1908. The first corn club was started in Monroe County in that year, and after that the program really took off across the state and spread to all the different counties. In 1915, the extension agent in Randolph County decided, as a way to do various programming, it would be neat to get all of the 4-H clubs from the county to come together and do an encampment. So they were going to do tent camping. They went to a family farm. It was the Jackson Crouch Farm, and stayed there for a week in July of 1915. And the kids named it Camp Good Luck. And Camp Good Luck was the world's very first 4-H camp. Unfortunately, when they wanted to do tent camping, the weather didn't cooperate very well, and a lot of time they spent in the barn because of the rain. But one of the visitors that they had to Camp Good Luck was a man by the name of William Kendrick. And Mr. Kendrick was the state 4-H leader at the time. And from what we understand, he came to Camp Good Luck, I believe dressed in like a three-piece suit, something like that, and it had rained a lot. He got caked from head to toe in mud and just came out looking like a mess, and apparently had the time of his life, thought that it was a wonderful way to do programming. So as he came back and started telling other agents, we need to do 4-H camping. This is a wonderful way to do programs. By the next year, we had 20 camps in the state. And shortly thereafter, Mr. Kendrick started studying a lot more about camping as a means to program with youth, and thought that it would be a good idea to try and find a place in the state to build a state 4-H camp. So he was working with a gentleman named Charles Hartley, who was the assistant director of the Extension Service, and they began looking around the state to try and find a place to build a state 4-H camp. Some folks from Lewis County contacted them and said, "You should look at Stonewall Jackson's boyhood home at Jackson's Mill. We think this would be a good place." So Mr. Kendrick and Mr. Hartley took the train from Morgantown to Clarksburg, and then took the trolley line from Clarksburg to Jackson's Mill. We had a trolley line that ran just across the West Fork River here. They came, they looked around. The only buildings that were really here at the time were the old original Jackson's Mill, because the house that Thomas Jackson had grown up in had burned down a few years before that. But they looked around and thought that this was a wonderful place to build a 4-H camp. At that time, it was all sort of used almost like a semi-public park. People would picnic here. They just used it as open space. They thought that this was great. But the mill and the surrounding area were owned by the Monongalia Traction Company, which now has morphed into Mon Power. So they contacted the company, and they graciously donated the old mill and 5 surrounding acres to West Virginia University in 1921, and that was the founding of Jackson's Mill as the world's very first state 4-H camp. So Mr. Kendrick moved here as the very first director and lived on the site, and it was really his vision for how Jackson's Mill came to be as a state 4-H camp. He was the one who decided that the buildings should be donated from the individual counties, and that's why our residential cottages are all named after counties. And then it was he who also came up with sort of the vision for the camping program. He worked a lot with a man named Ernest Thompson Seton, and Mr. Seton was the founder of the Woodcraft movement and a founder of the Boy Scouts of America, and was very involved in sort of getting camping programs going around the nation. He worked very closely with Mr. Kendrick, and one of the things that he would do with folks that worked with him, if he thought that they had done well or achieved something, he would give them nicknames based upon Native American names or symbols. And so while working with Mr. Seton, Mr. Kendrick acquired his nickname, which he was known by for the rest of his life, which is Teepee, which means meeting place. So for the rest of his life, he was happily known as Teepee Kendrick. Also, at the very first camp that was held here, the different leaders were given nicknames based upon family relationships. And the other gentleman who had a nickname that is known throughout West Virginia 4-H was Mr. Hartley. He was given the nickname of Uncle Charlie. So for the rest of their days, they were known as Teepee Kendrick and Uncle Charlie Hartley. With the Kendricks, in fact, and his wife was given a nickname as well of Watsy, which means one who helps the leader. On their tombstones in Morgantown at the East Oak Grove Cemetery, it says Teepee and Watsy. The program meant that much to them, and that was something that they were very proud of. Mr. Kendrick worked with the different counties to design the cottages. He left a lot of it open to them to do sort of the design that they wanted. And the only real requirements that he set were that each cottage had to have at least one porch and one fireplace, because he believed the porches and fireplaces were where you got together and made friends and had good conversation, told stories. That was a wonderful meeting place. He worked with the folks to design the layout of the camp, and so originally he believed that the camp would center around the old mill. So that's why in 1922 Lewis Cottage was the first one that was built here in Lewis County, and it was given the place of honor as being the closest to the old mill. In 1923, however, the very next year, they hired a firm from Pittsburgh to come in and did a master plan for the campus, and at that time it shifted the central focus of camp down to where the dining hall is today. And we like to joke that at that point Lewis Cottage became the most unpopular cottage at Jackson's Mill because it's the furthest away from the dining hall. It was closest to the old mill, but furthest from the dining hall. A little over a decade ago, it was also the first cottage to be refurbished, and air conditioning was added. So it's now become a very, very popular cottage again. We found the kids don't mind the walk to the dining hall if they can sleep in air conditioning. They're very happy about that. But all of our cottages here are named after counties. They're all named after single counties, and we're sponsored by them, with one exception. Northern Panhandle Cottage was built in 1950. By that point, it was getting very expensive to build new buildings at Jackson's Mill, so all of the counties of the Northern Panhandle came together to sponsor that one. It was also the only one that was completely designed and completed after T.P. Kendrick's death, so it does not have a porch. It has a meeting room in the front of it, but it doesn't have the porch concept that he really enjoyed so much. But all of our cottages have some wonderful stories to them. Most of them were built from donated labor, donated materials. One of my favorites is Webster Cottage. It was originally built as a very small log cabin. If you see it today, it's been added on to several times, but the original log cabin is still there in the middle. And building that cottage meant so much to the people of Webster County that when the cottage was dedicated in the 1920s, 600 people rode a special train from Webster Springs to Jackson's Mill to be here for the dedication. And so many of our buildings have these wonderful connections to people in that regard. And that's something that we're so proud of here, is that the camp takes on this sense of ownership to so many people that are here because they've had wonderful life events. 4-H has changed their lives. Other places that use it, Mountaineer Boys State, which is sponsored by the American Legion, has had their annual encampment here since the beginning of Boys State in 1936. They are the only American Legion Boys State to still be meeting at their original location. And they feel a wonderful sense of ownership of the campus. They're here as well because it transforms into a model state for 1 week a year, which is so interesting. And that really achieves a lot of the purpose that T.P. Kendrick thought, was that the camp was supposed to be a living place. And it was supposed to mean all of these things to different folks. And I think that we've really achieved that because the programming that we do here makes such a difference in folks' lives. It's interesting, the buildings, as I said, all have a wonderful history. The West Virginia building was actually, the interior of it was originally constructed in 1933 for the World's Fair in Chicago. Mr. Kendrick went to the fair, saw the building, which was built into a larger hall of states as our exhibit from the state. Thought that it was nice and wanted to have it at Jackson's Mill, so he wrote to the folks and said, could he have the building? And they said when the fair was done, if he wanted it, he could have it, but they had to figure out a way to transport it here. So some folks went to Chicago, took it apart piece by piece, put it on a train, shipped it here to Jackson's Mill, where they built the exterior that we now see, and then rebuilt that building inside of the exterior that's here now. So when folks go in the West Virginia building, they generally see something very similar to what you would have seen in the interior in Chicago in 1933. The dining hall story, as it looks like Mount Vernon, and the story behind that is that Mr. Kendrick took a group of 4-H'ers to a tri-county camp in Grottoes, Virginia in the 1920s. And at that time, the dining hall for Jackson's Mill was a temporary structure that was built here near the old mill. It sort of looked like a giant mess tent in a way, and it was known that it was going to be temporary. And on the way home from this tri-county camp, they stopped at Mount Vernon, and the kids took a tour there. And on the way home, one of them said, "Isn't it sad that almost no one from our state will ever get to see this?" And at the time, that was really true. Folks from West Virginia did not have a lot of disposable income to travel with. Transportation networks were very, very poor in the 1920s, so a lot of people wouldn't have gotten to see that. So on the way home, they decided that when they built the permanent dining hall at Jackson's Mill, they would make it to be a model of Mount Vernon, because they thought that was a nice way to let people see that and to honor George Washington, who had always considered himself a farmer beyond anything else, beyond being a statesman or professional soldier or anything of that nature. So we really, really love the history that we have here in so many respects. It started with the Jackson family, which is sort of what brought the area to prominence, and then it's really become a historic landmark of its own in terms of being the very first state 4-H camp in the nation and the world, and has quite often served as a model for use in other states and even other nations. We have records in our archives here at Jackson's Mill to show where in the 1930s, representatives from the Agriculture Ministry in Denmark came to visit Jackson's Mill to help model their 4-H program on that. So we're very proud of the history that we have here, and also the nearly 100 years of history of 4-H camping that West Virginia 4-H was a leader in originally and still is very happy to be a leader in today.